no introduction actually can do justice to the immensity of achievements that Professor Freeman has. However, this is a formal requirement, so I have to attempt this impossible task of introducing him. As per my knowledge, he is probably the most renowned and most accomplished professor of management of our time. He is probably best known for his award-winning book, Strategic Management, a Stakeholder Approach. This was originally published in 1984. So in that book, he traced the origins of the stakeholder idea to a number of others and suggested that businesses build their strategy around their relationships with key stakeholders. So among his many splendid achievements, he has connected the two seemingly irreconcilable domains of philosophy and management. He is actually dear to the researchers in strategy and entrepreneurship, as well as business ethics. So at present, Professor Freeman is a university professor at Ulsan Professor of Business Administration and an academic director of the Institute for Business in Society at the University of Virginia Darden School of Business. He is also an adjunct professor at Copenhagen Business School and a visiting professor at Nain Road Business School. So he holds many honorary appointments as a well-being professor at George Washington University. And he is recently awarded 6 honorary doctorates, some of them in economics and management. So without wasting much time, I invite Professor Freeman to deliver the talk on stakeholder capitalism.
Thank you very much. My apologies for being late. I think we just screwed up the time zones. It is very early here, and I apologize for any incoherence. I'm gonna blame it on the fact that I don't usually talk at 6 in the morning. And so anyway, let me try to preface what I'm going to say by, I think there's really good news. And the really good news is about how the underlying narrative, the story that is deep in the culture around the world is changing. And I'd like to talk about that and talk about how this new story, which I'm going to call stakeholder capitalism, works and what some of the challenges to it are. You all know the old story. The old story of business is it's all about the money. That money and profits are what really motivate business. And many people have a problem with that. They think they're somehow profits are bad. And if business is motivated by money and profits, then there's something fundamentally wrong with it ethically. Another piece to the old story is that business is primarily about shareholders, and these shareholders own the business. Now, I don't know about the law in India. I do know about the law in the US, and that's a problem. It's the idea that business is best understood in what economists call free and unregulated markets. And that people in business are only concerned with their short-term economic self-interest. And last of all, this old story says, yeah, well, I can tell you how I've experienced it. Tell people I teach business ethics, they have to manage not to laugh. They say, well, I didn't know business had any, or it must be a short course, or one I heard recently in a bar, and I think it was Copenhagen. Oh, business ethics. That's a theoretical subject, isn't it? And so this old story of business, if it ever was appropriate, is, I think, becoming less and less relevant in today's world. There's been a kind of perfect storm of issues that you can put together over the last 10 to 15 years. One, of course, was the global financial crisis, which affected all of us. And still, there's still vestigial limbs of that as governments have undertaken things like quantitative easing to try and prevent all the effects of this from being devastating. We have more awareness about inequality and poverty. We have more awareness, certainly in the US, but in other places and India as well, about continued racism, continued gender discrimination, or discrimination based on other issues. Now we have this vector of global warming and climate change in front of us. And with all this, we've had the reemergence of war in Europe, in addition to issues around terrorism. All this might be fine if the state were working smoothly and could help with all this, but it's not. One of the things, in addition, that we've seen is this sort of fracturing of governments, of the state. Add to all this, now you want to really make a perfect storm, add a pandemic to all of this. And it's very difficult to see. I don't know anybody who is arguing, unless they're just complete ideologues. Look, the way to deal with all of these societal issues is to really lock down on shareholder value, to really lock down on businesses making more money. No, what's happened is we've said, no, business has to be a part of the solutions to these issues. They're very important. And the initial data looks like not only are they saying it, but they're doing it. We've had many proposals for the reform of business and capitalism. We have more and more people interested in CSR, corporate social responsibility, corporate philanthropy, and sustainability, even though these are not new ideas. They're old ideas. We have a group in the US called Just Capital, JUST Capital, which, if you haven't seen their website, I would recommend it to you. What they're doing is holding companies' feet to the fire. They organize it by what stakeholders they're responsible for, and they're gathering data and measuring how companies are doing. Well, we have groups that are talking about inclusive capitalism, conscious capitalism. We have companies using the Sustainable Development Goals to actually run their business units. Even the finance people are getting in on the act, because they're talking about impact investing and ESG and socially responsible investing. We have literally millions of entrepreneurs around the world engaging in what people are calling social entrepreneurship. In other words, the idea that businesses you can create a business that does something good for society and makes money. And there are lots of others of these as well. And so, and this is not just some pie in the sky theory. This is companies out actually doing things. There are literally thousands of them all over the world. Meanwhile, some of our biggest companies, again, here I'm going to speak about the US because I know that best. The Business Roundtable, which is about 200 of the largest US companies, or the CEOs of those companies, have said the days of shareholder value are over. The right way to think about business is stakeholder value. Now, shareholder value is important. I'll come back to that. We've had Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, the largest investment company around, say roughly the same thing. People from the World Economic Forum have said the same thing. And just to prove the point, pundits from the left and the right are criticizing the idea. We had a bet for how long it would take the Wall Street Journal to publicly, write an editorial dismissing the Business Roundtable statement on stakeholder capitalism. The thinking was they would have an editorial the next day after the Business Roundtable statement. Turns out we were wrong. They had one that afternoon. So, the fact that there's such criticism is in part, I think, testimony for how big this change is. If we think about what people are saying about stakeholder capitalism, I think there's kind of four ways to understand that. And I'm going to argue that one of those ways is more productive. But the first way is to understand it as what people are calling virtue signaling. Look, this is just companies engaging in kind of PR. It's a PR strategy to get people to believe that business really cares about doing the right thing. But let's not be fooled. They really just care about the money. The people on the left of the political spectrum would say this is bad faith. It's business saying one thing and doing another. People on the right would say, well, they're just pandering to the politicians on the left. And so this virtue signaling view, which you can find in lots of op-ed editorials, is, I think, at best, a caricature of what's going on. Well, the second version of stakeholder capitalism, I'm going to call it's this CSR repackaged view. In other words, there's nothing new about this. It's just corporate social responsibility. It's kind of, this is the idea that it's kind of rooted in the dominant narrative, and Milton Friedman's argument that it's only shareholders that matter still is there. Now, in this view, people understand that sometimes companies actually mean this. So they're trying to do the right thing, unlike the virtue signal view. They're trying to do the right thing, but there's nothing new here, etc. The third view is what I would call a kind of global governance by elites view. Maybe, it's the idea that we need to fix capitalism at the system level. We need new governance structures to give the right incentives. And what we have to do is have government and corporate executives work together, probably in Davos, to figure out how the system needs to change. Now, my view of that is surely there needs to be some system changes, especially with the way kind of we treat capital markets. But I'm a little distrustful of just changing the system. I just don't think we're smart enough to understand how all the changes flow through the system And generally, when elites try and do that, it's ordinary people who pay the price. So I want to suggest a fourth view of stakeholder capitalism, and it's a very common sense view. It's no surprise to anyone who's read anything I've written over the past 40 years, and it's what I would call the business model view. Look, the change here is fundamentally about the business model. It's seeing the world a little bit differently. It's seeing business as fundamentally creating value for customers, suppliers, employees, communities, and people with some money. And that's what businesses do. It's what they've always done. Stakeholder capitalism says, I kind of realize that's what we're doing, so I can get better at it. Create value for shareholders, or that people are lazy and have to be incentivized to work. All of these things are very stylized views from economics and other disciplines that don't think very highly of business, that are in the grip of this old story of business. I found myself a postdoc at a pretty good business school, Wharton. And I didn't have any background. I didn't have any knowledge. I was maybe 24 years old and a philosopher. I was doing finishing my PhD in philosophy. And I needed to understand what business was like. And it just seemed, as I looked and talked to business people and spent time studying business, it looked to me obvious, just obvious, that what a business did was it created or sometimes destroyed. Usually it wasn't trying to destroy value for customers, suppliers, employees, communities, people with money. That was the right unit of analysis, if you like. Having a purpose made it easier to do that, but stakeholder capitalism is fundamentally about ways that companies create value for stakeholders. It will change the world, but it's changing the world one company and one stakeholder at a time. So with this idea, I found myself at the end of the Obama administration. That would have been, 2016, at a meeting at the White House. And the meeting was attended by all the people that had proposed reforms for big business. So there are people from Wall Street interested in impact investing. There were people from conscious capitalism, et cetera. And I was lucky enough to be there. And Thomas Perez, who was the U.S. Secretary of Labor, had called a meeting, and he wanted to know what businesses could do, what government and Department of Labor could do to really encourage people to do more around this. And one of the questions was, so what's the right brand? Is it conscious capitalism? Is it impact investing? What's the right way to think about this? And of course, everybody thought their way to think about it was the right way, but that's just the nature of the people there. I thought that was not a good question. I thought a better question was, what are the 4 or 5 kind of critical issues for reform that we have to deal with, that companies are dealing with, that will lead to some version of stakeholder capitalism, whatever the final brand turns out to be. I didn't really care. And so 2 colleagues, Ethan Parmar and Kirsten Martin, and I wrote a book called The Power of And: Responsible Business Without Trade-Offs, in which we identified 5 things that we thought were a part of in building this new story of business, this new narrative. And we put it around not throwing out the old story, but completing it and revising it. Because very rarely do we actually throw out the old story. We add to it. A good example of that is certainly in the US, when women win the right to vote. We don't throw out the idea, we don't throw away, well, men can't vote anymore. No, we add to it. The most powerful word in the language turns out to be and. We're not going to throw out the idea that profits are important, because they are. We're just going to add to it. So what I'd like to do is talk about each of these 5 things.
There is some issue with the mic.
With the mic, I'm using the.
Yeah, now it is okay.
Sorry?
It's okay now, but sometimes there is some loose connection probably.
Okay. I'll try to keep my hands off the wires. So 5 things. The first is to say, look, we need to think about purpose and profits. The old story gets the idea of purpose wrong. It says the purpose of a business is to make money for shareholders. Look, I need red blood cells to live. I think that's a fact. But it doesn't follow that the purpose of my life is to make red blood cells. Purpose is something else. Businesses must have profits to live. The idea that profits are bad is frankly a silly idea. It's an idea that comes from an ideology that doesn't understand how business works. Business must have profits to live. I'm fine to say they must have profits at the weighted average cost of capital, which is a complicated finance idea, but it turns out it's almost always 10%, but it's still, they must have profits. It's that. But that's not the purpose of a business. Even sometimes, I've had to spend times when I had to actually worry about making red blood cells. A few years ago, I had both my hips replaced. It was a long surgery. I lost about 4.5 pints of blood, and I had to actually worry about making red blood cells. But it still didn't follow that that was the purpose of my life. Purpose is something else. Purpose is what you stand for. It's what gets you out of bed in the morning. It's why you're doing what you're doing. And it's a very important idea. It's a strong force. It's not always good, because you can have, we had a number of people a few years ago come to Charlottesville, where I live, to march, and they were Nazis and white supremacists. They had purpose, but that purpose wasn't good. So when I say purpose, I'm going to mean you got to have purpose and values and ethics. Now, we have this idea that entrepreneurs start a business, to make as much money as they can. When I have students come to me and say, I'm going to start this business, then I'm going to sell it, I'm going to flip it and be rich, I tell them, you really ought to get a job, because starting a business and building it is hard and it takes lots of years. A friend who started a restaurant in Copenhagen called Noma, it's routinely voted one of the best restaurants in the world. And he said, we didn't start Noma to make as much money as we can. because we didn't make any for the first 19 years. You know, entrepreneurs start a business because they're on fire about something. They have a kind of different idea about the world and that they want to share with people. And thinking about only profits doesn't do it. We need the narrative of business to think about purpose and profits. And that's one of the challenges. And one of the things that we see going on is people talking about purpose and trying to discover or rediscover. Oftentimes what happens is entrepreneurs feel very strongly about purpose, and then somewhere along the way this gets diluted or deleted, and it's hard to get it back. So purpose and profits is the first one. Second one, pretty straightforward. It's about stakeholders and shareholders. Look, shareholders are incredibly important, but they're not the only thing that's important. In fact, I would say, gee, how much money you make for shareholders is directly dependent on how much value you create for customers and suppliers and employees and communities. The key principle here is not only are there more stakeholders than shareholders, which is something we've known for a long time, and I get way too much credit for. The key principle here is that stakeholders are joint, they're interdependent. How you create value for one depends on how you create value for the other, which is why you can't think about trade-offs here. I learned this from a CEO of a chemical company a long time ago. He was they were seen as kind of the dirtiest company on earth, big company, and he decides to clean it up. So he announces for, you know, like zero pollution or some lofty, more green goals. And he's going around making, the speech to all the facilities about, we mean this. Engineers at one facility come up to him and say, sorry, we can't meet these interim targets. This plant and equipment's too old. This process is too dirty. We'll never meet it. And the CEO, as he tells the story, said, well, we're going to have to close. Then we'll have to close the plant. We're serious about this. In other words, you want me to make a trade-off? Environment, community on the one hand, employees and their jobs on another. Environment wins, employees lose. Engineers go away. They come back pretty soon, several weeks, and they say, actually, a miracle has occurred. We figured out how to do it. And the CEO says, well, how much is it going to cost? And the engineer said, well, we're embarrassed to say if we do it this new way, we're going to save money. Now, what's going on? What's going on is when a trade-off is unacceptable, we kick into gear the only real resource we have, which is up here, our human capital, our creative imagination. And when we can use our creative imagination, then we can get out of this trade-off thinking. The way I like to put it is you have to think about stakeholder interest not as being balanced or being traded off with each other, but you have to think about it as being harmonized. Harmony in music is a wonderful idea. The notes are different, can be very different, but they sound good together. And great musicians make them sound good together. The other thing I would say about understanding how stakeholders work is we have to think about this as a relationship, not a set of transactions. And this fundamentally is a different way of thinking about business, to think about it as a set of stakeholder relationships that are interconnected. If I think in relationship terms, there's several things I have to keep in mind. One, there's a presumption if I'm in a relationship with someone, just think about it personally, it's the same thing. If I'm in a relationship with someone, there's a presumption it's going to continue. There's the idea that both parties to the relationship actually care about the other party. And there's the idea that, we don't have to keep score every day. Look, sometimes the relationship is not working, and so we have to end it. No question about that. But the idea of keeping score every day turns it into a transaction, not a relationship. My wife and I have been married for 45, better get this right. Yeah, 45 years. If I were to walk down the hall to her office and say, hey, babe, I've been thinking, and I think after this 45 years, you owe me 3. You're ahead by 3. I'm pretty sure I know what the answer to that would be. And it wouldn't be great for me. She's a 2nd-degree black belt in martial arts. So I'm not going to do that. But keep score. And that's one of the great things about relationships. Same in business. You create value, but you don't have to keep score every day. There are times for talking about that, and there are times for not. If you're always talking about your relationship, you don't have one. And so we need to think about stakeholders in these relationship terms. That means we need continuous engagement and two-way conversations. So purpose and profits, stakeholders and shareholders. Number 3, we got to see business as embedded in society and subject to societal forces as well as market forces. Of course, in business and business schools, we know about market forces, everything from, Michael Porter's 5 forces to, everything else, to 3 C's or 5 M's or whatever the latest models are that look at market forces. But business also is subject to societal forces. All this flap over in the US, again, I'm not sure about India, about ESG and whether that's relevant or not. Gosh, it's certainly relevant to most of the businesses that I know. Business needs to be responsive to those issues that it can affect. You don't have to do everything on every issue, of course not. No one can do that. But you do have to figure out how to respond to those societal issues that you can do something about and that affects you and affects your employees for sure. We see that with respect to things like gender discrimination. Businesses can do things about this, and they need to. And of course, we have the whole specter of global warming. Now, this doesn't mean that every business has to tackle global warming. It's a complicated issue. But there are many businesses who can do more than they're doing. And that's the kind of thing that we need. So look, I'm gonna go quickly here. Purpose and profits, stakeholders and shareholders, business as a societal institution, and a market institution. And the next one I shouldn't have to say, but I do. We need to see people in business for what they are. It's fully human and complicated. Yes, there are people who only worry about their economic self-interest, their short-term economic self-interest, and only themselves. We generally call them sociopaths, but and at least in the U.S., we elect them to office. That's nonpartisan. But anyone who's had a child, anyone who's ever been in love, anybody who's ever been in a real relationship knows we're capable of much more. We're capable of some pretty bad stuff, but we're capable of incredible acts of kindness and caring for others, etc. In fact, I think business is built on this idea. It's built on the idea that we can cooperate together to do things for others. You know, what's a complicated human being? A human being is someone who can literally invent vocabularies to solve our problems, and then cooperate together to make those real. So, I mean, I've got an iPhone here. Think for a minute about how we get to iPhone. So start with the time when we were, coming down from the trees in the savannas of Africa, and somehow we evolved to get to an iPhone. What did we have to do? Well, we had to invent a lot of vocabularies. We didn't just find the periodic table and go, oh, that's chemistry. No, we invented that. And we had to invent I'm going to ask people to turn. Yeah, there we go. Turn the volume off. We had to invent the vocabulary around glass and metal and physics, etc. What we do is we invent vocabularies to solve our problems, and we can cooperate to make those real. So I don't think there are any of those issues, those societal issues, that perfect storm set of issues that we can't solve. But we solve them with creative imagination. We solve them with businesses, coming up with new ideas, with new ways to make our society better. It's not just about economics, though of course that's important. Of course it's important to figure out, how to feed our families and how to live in a way that we can exercise our creative imagination. Purpose and profits, stakeholders and shareholders, societal issues and market issues, our complex humanity and economics. And finally, we have to put business and ethics together. This idea that those things are separate is disrespectful. Most of the business people I know are not greedy little bastards out trying to do each other in. They are folks who want to cooperate, who want to, for the most part, do the right thing, who get up in the morning and want to do something that makes a difference. And I think when we come to put business and ethics together, we have a chance to build great companies. Well, the result of these 5 principles is a stakeholder capitalism that really works. We're beginning to accumulate evidence that companies that pay attention to stakeholders actually perform better on their traditional financial metrics. There's some studies that show they perform much, much, much better. There are others that show that They perform better on a few basis points better. But the idea that you can perform well and take advantage of customers, suppliers, employees, and communities in today's world where everything's in the open. And I guess the one thing I didn't say about that perfect storm that I left out is, of course, much of this is brought to you by technology and social media, where there's no place to hide. There's no place from which you can, not be seen for what you're doing. At least that's increased radically. So the idea here is, again, I think, good news. The underlying story of business is changing. That means actually for us in business schools, we have a substantial task ahead of us. We have to do nothing less than change some of the ways that we teach, because still, unfortunately, a lot of what we teach is based on this old story. We have to change this idea that what's most important to us is publishing our work in journals that are wrapped around the old story. This is hard to do. If we don't do it, business schools will be irrelevant. Let me stop there and see if anybody has questions or comments or loud exclamations of "that's the silliest thing I've ever heard," or whatever it is you'd like to say.
Thank you very much, and I think we can take questions.
Yeah, good evening. I'm Balram in the Operations Management Group of IIM Calcutta. This argument has fascinated me a lot for more than 2 decades, from the time I read a lot about Toyota and the way they go about doing things. And what I quickly wanted to share is I have also, over my more than 20 years of teaching at IIM Calcutta, incorporated these aspects in how I go about teaching operations management, which otherwise often comes across as something which is more from the point of view of maximizing the shareholder wealth. And as a faculty member, I derive a lot of satisfaction doing the teaching this way. And I also—
So do I.
Yeah.
So do we.
Yeah. So the same I notice among students also. But what has always been a curiosity is that there is evidence to show that if you were really following that stakeholder approach, stakeholder capitalism as what you have described, there is even evidence to show that your profitability could be higher. I'm just wondering, and I post that as in the chat also, why is it that for some reason or other, people at very senior levels don't seem to be inclined? Is it like they tried and failed because of some other issues, some other difficulties, maybe including how they ended up being in that position?
Well,
Or
that's
is
a great question, Balram. It's one that's fascinated me as well. I would say several things to it. One, it is capturing the imagination of CEOs around the world now. It certainly, when I wrote my old book, I got to tell you, pretty much nobody cared. And I've just been trying to, for the most part, find different ways to say it over a lot of years. When I say nobody cared, it's not quite true. When I talked to the people who were on the firing line, who actually had to deal with customers, or the HR people who dealt with employees, etc., they understood this. By the time things worked their way up to CEOs, it had been financialized. And they were, for the most part, in the 80s, in the grip of this old story. Now, that's not true for all. Some companies have been run this way for a very long time, right? Today, more and more companies are kind of getting the message. The Business Roundtable's 181 CEOs of the biggest companies in the U.S. Signed this. I don't know exactly who signed the World Economic Forum's version of it, but more and more people are kind of getting the idea, because you're right. There's evidence that, even if all you care about is the money, this is pretty much the way to do it. Now, some people have said, well, so there's nothing new here. This is just another way to do shareholder value. Yeah, but if you don't really care about customers, they're going to figure it out. Now, the other issue, and I see some people in the chat have put this in as well, is this about long-term versus short-term? I think that's an interesting question for us business school professors to think about. As I've gotten older, I've become increasingly skeptical of this distinction. I've been told a long time, Ed, this ethics and stakeholder stuff makes sense in the long term, but in the short term, it's about the money. Well, as the short term gets closer, when does it start to make sense? As the short term gets closer, the long term gets further apart. And look, we live life in the short term. So I've begun to distrust this distinction, because I think it's a way of avoiding doing the hard things. I'm enormously in favor of the short term. I'm in favor of doing the right things for stakeholders today and figuring out, by using our imagination, what that is, so that there's a good future. I believe it was Jack Welch who said, anybody can manage for the short term, anybody can manage for the long term. Problems in between. How do you manage? And the metaphor I love is, how do you manage with bifocal vision? With bifocals, you see up close and in the distance, right? How do we create value for stakeholders that's value today and lets us create value in the future? That's the way I like to think about that. And I think we need more. We need to think about that more. And there's certainly much more creativity involved in this. This is hard to do. The stakeholder idea is amazingly simple, right? It just says, hey, you got to deal with those groups that can affect you, that you can affect. Now look, I grew up poor in the American South on a farm. We didn't have much, but we knew we had to deal with people that could affect us or that we could affect. That's just life. The hard thing is how do you do it without making trade-offs? How do you keep this intersection of interest in harmony over time? That's very hard to do, and there's a lot of work that we need to do with that. So I hope, I know more and more CEOs are interested, and the fact that stakeholder capitalism itself is controversial now in the U.S. I've spent my career kind of pissing off people from the left and the right. The people on the left think I've sold out to business, because I think business is one of the most important societal institutions we've ever invented, right? It's brought billions of people out of poverty, and it's going to bring billions more out of poverty. And they think I've sold out to business, which they see as kind of bad and questionable. And the people on the right think I'm a communist because I think, you got to be responsible for the effects of your action. I take it that's just ethics one, So I don't have a political affiliation here. I think it's just good business,
Yeah.
So I don't know if that makes any sense or not.
Yeah. So this has always been my curiosity. What appears to be something of great return? Why is that? Why people are not putting enough effort on that?
Well, the other thing I want to say is these old stories have a real grip on us. And it takes a while to change. How long have we been trying to change the story that men and women are morally equal?
Yes.
A long time.
Yeah.
How are we doing on that? Well, I mean, we've made some progress, but we still got a long ways to go. These stories or these narratives that we grow up with are really hard to change, and it takes generations.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Shivam, can you go ahead?
Yes, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I have a question that in some cases that some stakeholders might outweigh the other stakeholders in terms of political power. And satisfying these political stakeholders is very detrimental for firm survival. So in pursuit of satisfying these political shareholders, firms might compromise or falter upon the business ethics part. So how do you suggest we should balance these dynamics?
Well, I don't think you can balance those dynamics. I think, again, you have to use creative imagination here. And you essentially have to look, if you consistently don't pay attention to one stakeholder in a free society like India or the US, they're going to go to government to get their interest taken care of. Now, that doesn't mean what's going to result is anything good for you. So I think it's better to try to do this voluntarily and not trade off. I can do this to easily satisfy the powerful, right? You have to think about this not as a trade-off. And again, as I've said, this is hard to do. You have to look for the win-win-wins, not look at, gee, I could do this and I'll let my ethics slip a little bit, because then your employees see that or your customers see it. And that's a slippery slope straight to hell. At least that's what I think. But it's hard to do. I have a friend who's CEO of a pretty big company who says, look, once you start asking the win-win-win questions, it gets easier to do. It's a skill. I think we spend way too much time in business schools worried about trade-offs. And so that we train people to think in terms of trade-offs. And if you always trade off, look, I'll just say, in the U.S., we have a lot of laws. And a lot of these laws, like the laws governing labor relations or the environment, et cetera, a lot of them exist because companies ignored the interest of key stakeholders, right? In the worst case, we have the Fair Labor Practices Act and the Wagner Act, which are laws that govern unions and labor relations, in part because Henry Ford, way back in the day, put detectives on the trail of union leaders and sent people out to beat up the workers that were on strike. That's trade-off thinking at its worst.
Yeah.
So I look, this isn't easy, and it's so seductive to try and satisfy the political stakeholders. But ultimately, you have to do this in terms of your business model. And by business model, I mean to include, what do you stand for? What's your purpose? What are the values that you stand for? Why do we show up here every day? That's a part of the business model. What societal problems are we trying to solve? That's a part of the business model.
Ramya?
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, I just wanted to know what fundamental changes must we make in the way we teach subjects such as strategic management?
Well, a long time ago, the title of my old book was Strategic Management, the Stakeholder Approach. I thought I was a strategy guy. In fact, I wrote that old book as a textbook. Now, that was a horrible idea. I tried to teach it as a textbook once, and it doesn't do very well. There's no question about that. We wrote another book that no one's ever heard of called The Logic of Strategy that tried to be a better way to teach it. But, I don't think the question, why do some firms have competitive advantage? I don't think that's a very interesting question. I don't think it's nearly as interesting as people like my friend Jay Barney and others think it is. And so I like to think about how do stakeholders cooperate together to create value. And then competitive advantage comes up, but it's a kind of down the line question. It's not the sort of first question in strategy that you would ask. And so I haven't taught strategy in probably 8 or 10 years. But when I did the last time, that's the way we taught it, was to try to say, look, let's first deal with why stakeholders, why and how you get stakeholders to cooperate together to create value. Competitive advantage, tries to say, take as a sort of a dominant question, why do some firms perform better than others? And again, I don't think those, and there's something in the literature now called new stakeholder theory. And new stakeholder theory supposedly takes those questions as central. Well, I'm in favor of old stakeholder theory, which puts the sort of ethical questions about purpose and values in the center. For the most part, and this is in part what's wrong with the field, for the most part, scholars in strategy don't want to do normative work. They have this very strong normative empirical distinction or normative conceptual distinction. Unfortunately, they haven't read much philosophy in a long time. I'm a pragmatist as a philosopher, which means that, facts and values and interpretation are always kind of entangled. When I put as a central question, why do some firms perform better than others? I've assumed a whole bunch of stuff that you would say is normative. Is that a good thing? I mean, I don't know. I would say if we can put that stakeholder question, cooperation, in terms of purpose and values center. For a long time, strategy was, where are we going? How do we get there? What do we do tomorrow? Are we on track? And I thought when I wrote my old book, I didn't think the stakeholder idea was the most interesting idea in it, because I thought that was just too much common sense. again, remember, I'm coming from philosophy and I don't really know much about management theory. I thought the interesting idea was to say, before you ask where you're going, you need to ask, what do you stand for? That what you stand for might determine where you're willing to be going, etc. So I thought the idea of purpose, which is in that book, I thought that was more interesting than the idea of stakeholders. Now, not a single other person thought that, but I certainly did.
Next is, it's written user. Can you please? The question is on the chat window. Do you think that showing businesses that stakeholder approach gives better return is the only way to nudge them towards a more inclusive stakeholder approach? If that is so, are we not again back to the old story of profit?
Well, that's one way. I tend to think that it's about the business case, and the business case is not, on my view, just how much money do you make. The business case, if someone's going to do a business case analysis, they need to analyze how a particular practice fits with the business's purpose, how it fits with how they're trying to manage their stakeholder relationships. Yes, profits are a piece of that, but it's only a piece. And so this idea that it's either profits or it's nothing is a part of the old story. And I want to reject that way of putting it. Sometimes what you have to do is you have to say, I'm not going to frame things that way, because thinking about stakeholders and purpose and societal issues and our full humanity frames things in a different way. And so many critics try to reduce it to the old story. And of course, the whole idea of a new narrative is you frame things in a different way.
Yeah, Rajin Gupta, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Professor Freeman, wonderful to see you. I saw you the other day when MDI was holding a book launch function. First, I wish to fully endorse, this has been my view, that purpose of the organization is the prime thing, what drives everything else. But I also wish to raise a kind of a cautionary red flag. And it comes from my own reflection. Many years ago, one day I realized that I was a part of the problem, in the sense that I actually at least can see myself as playing the role of three stakeholders myself. As an employee of an organization, I want the best of money, best of services, best of facilities. Then I'm also a customer of many things. And I want things, minimum price, best quality. And then soon enough, I decided to invest some of my savings in mutual funds. So then I wanted maximum returns. And that day I realized that I was really part of the problem. How can I expect companies to really have a, kind of a vision of managing stakeholders when I, even as an individual, have such demands on the company, on the organizations? So I wish to create it as a red flag. I suppose it is important, perhaps for most of us, And I believe, I could be wrong, having been a management professor for quite some time, a few decades, I don't think professors actually even see this, that they are part of the problem. And if
Well-
I, as a professor, am pursuing this kind of a conflicting stakeholder views, how can I inspire my students? How can I teach my students anything different? So that to me is and of course I'm speaking for myself, this could be true for a large percentage of population. So companies have to face this, their employees, their customers, their shareholders, who are making demands which are so difficult to balance or harmonize, if I may use the word.
Well, I think
This-
that's a great question. It's one I've thought about for a long time, and I've had a hard time getting other people to think about it. That is, look, the way the stakeholder idea originally developed, long before I had anything to do with it, and has developed since, is as a kind of functional idea. In other words, marketing deals with customers, finance deals with investors, HR deals with employees, etc. Who deals with the person who's an employee, who's also an investor, who's also a customer? I'd be
Right.
willing to bet that they are different than just the individuals in each of those three. In other words, if I'm an employee and a customer and an investor, I might have more or less patience for what a company has done. Because we don't have, we've gotten sort of stuck in these functional roles. We haven't had much research about the role overlap and what that does. And I think there's a tremendous amount to be done here, especially if in fact we don't assume that the only thing that customers want is best quality at low price. Yes, they might want that, but there might be other things that are involved here. There to find no trade-offs among what seem to be conflict. What we have to do is look at multiple currencies, multiple kind of possibilities for how to create value here. And I don't think we've begun to explore that and how important that is. So I completely agree with you here. I think that's one of the most interesting questions that we need a lot more research on, etc.
Thank you. I wish to finally, a last point I want to make. The way I see the way forward, of course, you have talked about purpose and values, which are, of course, very important. But given my own philosophical orientation, given Indian philosophical orientation, I believe it is actually also a question of consciousness. Actually, you have rightly pointed out that on the part of the executives, chief executives, or shareholders, it requires immense amount of creativity, imagination, to really go beyond this what you call the trade-off approach to an integrative approach. And my understanding is that it is rather than talking about values, which is of course one expression of it, it is a matter of consciousness. And I am a believer, based on my own experience, of my personal experience, as well as my experience of doing meditation to improve my consciousness. And I know there is some research which shows that executives who do meditation tend to have a broader perspective So I believe one of the ways to move in this direction is to promote raising consciousness of the business community, and of course, not only business but wider upgradation of consciousness, which is what will take us there. And fortunately, the overall indications are that world over, slowly but surely, on the whole, the consciousness of humanity is improving. And that is why these theories are becoming, at least people are listening to it and willing to consider in it, even if they are not able to act on it. So that's my submission, sir.
Well, look, I agree with you. I think consciousness is one way, one metaphor to use here that works. I mean, I've been on the board of a group called Conscious Capitalism, which started by my friend John Mackey, who built a company here in the U.S. called Whole Foods, and they talk a lot about raising consciousness, etc. I don't think that's the only way. I think that's one explanation that will work for many people. But I also want to find other explanations around, for instance, having a sense of self that's relational, so that you are not just responsible for yourself, but you're at least partially responsible. Sorry. That you're responsible for. Well, I feel very strongly that those people I'm closest to, I have a moral responsibility to. You can turn that into raising consciousness, but I don't think you have to. I think there are multiple ways to get there. And I agree with you. We need more of those. We need more. I don't know how you can exist in today's world without meditating. It's just too. It's too much, at least for me. So, thank you. I think those are great.
Yeah, I will not go into greater depth on this question. So I would thank you very much, Professor Freeman, and I would let other people have their questions addressed. Thank you. Thanks to everybody.
Yes, sir. There is one question which is like, are the core values of stakeholder capitalism different for developing countries? I think what he has in mind is like, depending on the problems that developing countries are facing. So is there any difference in the core values? Because there is more problem that's related to meeting their basic requirements and things like that.
Well, again, I've thought about this. I've worked in developing countries. I'm just finishing a book now about a business family in Indonesia that has funded a project to radically decrease cases of dengue fever. And what they've done, they can with this technology get rid of. Well, they can reduce dengue cases by 78%, reduce hospitalizations by over 80%, and of course, dengue is a scourge throughout much of the developing world. I don't think the values are different. If you ask people all over the world what their top 3 values are, they tell you the same thing. It's about respect, caring for others, integrity, being responsible. Those are honesty. Those are the kinds of things that come out. What's different, of course, is that respect in, well, Jakarta is different than respect here in Charlottesville. Well, those are cultural differences. And so a lot of the differences that we think are values, differences in values, are really differences in culture. And we have to figure out, because we have the same values, we have a basis to start from, to try and understand in a more nuanced way what some of the cultural differences are that we have to work through. There are issues in India that are not issues in the US. There are issues in the US, not issues in India. The cultures are different, but I'd be willing to bet that most of you on this call love your children just as much as I love mine. And there's a lot of similarity. We like to focus on difference. I like to focus on what we have in common. I think we are really good at cooperating together, and really good at figuring out how we can work together to create something that no one of us could do alone. And that's really the essence of stakeholder theory.
Thank you so much. I think one last question, if I can ask, is like, if in the face of a conflict between profitability and sustainability, what would you suggest?
You got to figure out how to have both. It's not one versus the other. And again, framing the question as which one, I remember some years ago, I get a call from a reporter who says, Professor Freeman, should companies have profits or ethics? And I said, I hear that as a question of, do I want a heart or do I want a lung? I'm kind of in favor of both of those things. So I think we need to be skeptical about how questions are framed. Of course, businesses have to make money. Silly to think they don't. And they need to be sustainable. Certainly, there's not one way to do that. It's like, just like there's not one way to be profitable. There's not one way to be sustainable. And if I've said anything today, it's the importance of using our creative imagination to figure some of this stuff out.
Thank you very much. I hope there are no more questions. Thank you very much for being able to make it. And thank you all for attending.
Thank you for being such a great host. And you've given me lots of questions to think about, for sure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.